Despite the fact that women have been involved in motorsport since cars first started competing, their presence in racing has often been met with derision, jokes, or abuse. Even many of history's seemingly good faith efforts to encourage greater participation by women were thinly disguised attempts to discredit them. Today on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, I'm delving into a very particular NASCAR race, the 1977 Firecracker 400. 3 of the finest women drivers in the world entered this race and earned plenty of headlines from the media, but many believe that the goal was not to promote these successful drivers. Instead, many of the people involved in the event have argued that the entire goal of the 1977 Firecracker 400 was to put a stop to increasing female participation in motorsport by making the women look incompetent. For this episode, I spoke on the phone with Janet Guthrie, one of the 3 women involved in this race and whose autobiography first introduced me to the drama centering around the event. While I did personally speak with Guthrie, I have agreed to honor her request that recordings of her voice not be used for this episode, and that I read aloud the quotes that she shared with me. I understand that this isn't the most conventional approach, but my goal with this podcast is to share complex stories in the most respectful way possible, and this is how Guthrie wanted to be represented. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. Before we really dig into the meat of this episode, I want to touch on a few pieces of motorsport history that I think are particularly relevant here, with the first being the role that women have played in racing throughout the years. Let me make one thing abundantly clear. Women have always played a part in motorsport. The act of racing a car has often been associated with men for countless different reasons that primarily relate to the fact that Western society has been deeply patriarchal for most of recorded history. Men were the ones who were allowed to make and spend money, and who were freely able to own property or other expensive assets. Early cars were challenging to drive, and the people that drove them likely needed a decent amount of physical strength to start and then maneuver those machines. Men have also just been freer to do whatever the hell they want to do, while the lives of women are more carefully dictated by the rules of decorum and sociability. But that's not to say that women didn't race and never raced. In fact, in that incredible period of time between the birth of the automobile and the Second World War, there were tons of incredible women doing incredible things, both in racing and in the automotive world in general. Let me give you a few examples. Camille Dugast was one of the first women to compete in long distance and road course racing, including the 1901 Paris to Berlin race, while Helenice was involved in Grand Prix racing in the 20s and 30s, including a trip over to America to put on exhibition runs at board tracks. Over in America, Alice Hoyler Ramsey became the first woman to drive across the continental United States, a feat she achieved in 1909 when she was just 22 years old. Accompanying her on the trip were her 2 older sisters-in-law and her friend Hermine Jans, none of whom could drive a car. The problem is that throughout history, we've really always tried to keep women racers segmented off from their male counterparts. Yes, there have been a lot of events where a woman could compete on equal terms, but there were also a lot of instances of women being segmented off into their own shorter races or into their own class. These events were often known as the coup de dame, and as the name suggests, these were women-only events designed to keep women in one sphere and men in another. We saw a really stark shift in attitudes after World War II. Again, yes, women did race in various series around the world, but overall, society kind of took a step backwards when the conflict ended. Many women in the Western world had experienced a greater sense of autonomy when the men in their lives had been sent off to war. Women had to join the workforce to make a living, or in rural areas, perhaps they tended land, ran a farm, or found other ways to keep their family fed. Many women took it upon themselves to protect the land they lived in and to contribute to the war effort in various other ways. But when the conflicts ended, things changed. Anytime any community goes through a collective trauma, there are repercussions, and the fallout for many of those massively traumatic incidents involves the idealization of the way things used to be. There's this really deep yearning for what is ultimately an idealized notion of what the past was before this traumatic event happened and robbed us of our innocence. And one of the big repercussions of World War II was the view that women were these sacred, perfect creatures that needed to be protected from all danger. This manifested itself in a lot of ways. In America, for example, that meant women were expected to give up manufacturing jobs and either transition into becoming a homemaker or to take on a less physically intensive career somewhere else. And in the racing world, that often meant women were actively banned from competition in events or at tracks where they had otherwise been freely able to compete. Thankfully, society continued to evolve, and communities around the world really started to advocate for equality. By the early 1970s here in America, we had seen the growth of movements advocating for Black and Latino Americans as well as for women, and a lot of these movements stemmed from attitudes and beliefs that first started gaining roots during World War II. If you could work, fight, and die for your country, the logic went, then you surely should have access to things like education, integrated public spaces, and livable wages. Obviously, not everyone in America agreed that these were rights that everyone should have, regardless of race or gender identity or creed or sexual orientation. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had to have those movements in the first place. And as you can probably imagine, there were many segments of the population that were particularly threatened by the idea that they might no longer be the masters of their particular domain. That mindset was definitely apparent in American motorsport at the time. Professional top-tier racing was a boys' club. It was a man's sport. You'll hear this again and again throughout this episode. Women were a distraction, or at worst, they were actively dangerous to the male competitors. In club-level racing, women were starting to break into the scene in a more active basis in the 60s and 70s, but in NASCAR and American open-wheel racing, it was almost absurd to suggest that a woman might be treated as an equal competitor. That now brings us to NASCAR. The stock car series was founded in late 1947, with the first Cup Series race held on February 15, 1948, just a few weeks later. Its roots traced back to Prohibition-era car modification that later turned into organized racing, and the sport's home was at Daytona Beach, where many land speed records had been set in the 20s and 30s. What started as a fairly small organization exploded, and by the mid-1970s, it was huge. Drivers would show up in huge numbers every weekend, desperate to compete for a spot in one of the primary legitimate forms of professional motorsport in the United States. But despite the fact that some women had competed in those early days of NASCAR, as the sport grew more professionalized, they really started to exclude women and keep them from racing in their series. Part of NASCAR's success came from the fact that it had maintained several key races throughout the years. Names have changed to accommodate sponsors, but those races that started back in the day, many of them are still happening today. One of those races was the Firecracker 400. That race was founded in 1959 as a 250-mile race before becoming a 400-mile event in 1963. Since it was hosted on or around Independence Day, it took on that cool Firecracker name, and the event was only recently moved to August. The race got its first sponsorship from Pepsi and then Coca-Cola in 2008. Those names took over the name Firecracker, and so that became more of a general NASCAR race, no longer associated with the 4th of July weekend. Next, let's look at the key players in the Firecracker 400. I want to introduce you to the 3 women involved in this race because their stories deserve to be heard. Let's start with Christine Becker. Born in Uccle, Belgium on December 4th, 1943, Becker got her start in the rally world when she was 23 years old. For 2 years at the start of her career, she drove for a German manufacturer called NSU, and in 1967, after competing in 29 events in a single year, she was awarded the title of Belgian Woman Drivers Champion, a title she'd go on to take 5 times. She regularly entered races using only her first name, Christine, because she needed no additional introduction. The details of her career are pretty hard to come by on the English-speaking internet, but we do know that in 1968, she took on some single-seater racing in the Formula V category alongside her rallying career, and she was soon hired as an official Alfa Romeo driver for the Benelux team, where she would regularly win in her class. She was a regular fixture at the 24 Hours of Spa, an event she contested a total of 11 times, and she also raced in the 24 Hours of Le Mans 4 times between 1973 and 1977. While she clocked notable finishes in both events, she really made a name for herself in 1974 when, alongside fellow female drivers Marie Laurent and Yvette Fontaine, she took victory in the 2-liter class behind the wheel of a Chevron Seiko. Becker raced in a little bit of everything. She took victories in hill climbs and in various GT races before branching out into the rally world. In 1972, she took overall victories at touring car races at Dijon and Paul Ricard, and despite suffering a nasty crash at Le Mans, she also started running a racing school. As many women were at the time, Becker was often paired with other female racers when she took on challenges abroad. In 1977, for example, Becker was paired with Lella Lombardi at the Rolex 24 and the 24 Hours of Le Mans, and they would go on to race against each other in NASCAR later that year. Her racing career wound to a close with a few outings at the Paris-Dakar Rally before she pursued a career in motorsport journalism. She had been engaged to a French racer named Roger Dubois, who was sadly killed in a racing accident in the 1973 24 Hours of Spa. Later in life, she married a man named Louis Schmitz. Together, the two helped sponsor Thierry Boutsen in Formula One. It was there that they became friends with Ayrton Senna, who helped the couple adopt 2 children from Brazil. Every now and again, Christine Becker pops out of the woodwork to take part in vintage racing events, often behind the wheel of an Alfa Romeo. Next in our cast of characters is Maria Grazia Lombardi, better known as Lella Lombardi, who is remembered as being the only woman to score any points in Formula One and the only F1 driver to ever only score a half point. Born in Frugolo, Piedmont, Italy, on March 26, 1941, Lella Lombardi learned how to drive a car in order to serve as a delivery driver for her father's butcher shop. She headed into the world of karting for a while before saving up to buy a car she could race in the 1965 Formula Monza series. Her father allegedly found her racing career difficult to accept for the first few years. It wasn't until she took a hard-fought second-place finish in 1968 that he accepted his daughter had talent and that she was a capable competitor behind the wheel. Lombardi spent several years in lower-tier Formula Series, winning 4 of 1970's 10 Formula 850 races before taking that series championship in 1971. She moved up to Italian Formula 3 for the next 2 years, finishing 10th in the standings both times. It was there that her talent was spotted by John Webb, who popped her behind the wheel of a Ford Escort in his Celebrity Escort Mexico series. Lombardi made a serious impression when she beat some extremely talented men in the category, and it earned her a test drive and then later a race seat with Jackie Epstein's Shell Sport F5000 Lola T330. Even though wins were pretty hard to come by, Lombardi impressed everywhere, from Europe to America, where she took part in the US F5000 series. It gave her the confidence she needed to rent a Brabham BT42 from Bernie Ecclestone for £5,000 and make her Formula One debut with the Allied Polymer Group at the 1974 British Grand Prix. She failed to qualify for the race, but that largely came down to the fact that she had a drive shaft failure during practice. In 1975, Lombardi took a seat in the March F1 team after she secured funding from a man named Count Gugi Zanon, the same man who helped kickstart Ronnie Peterson's career. Her first race of the season was in South Africa, where she did manage to qualify for a spot in the field before retiring with fuel system problems. Still, she made history by becoming the first woman to qualify for and start a Grand Prix since Maria Teresa de Filippis. She made further history in the next race, the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix, when she became the first and still the only woman to score any points in Formula One, but the race was overshadowed by tragedy. Ahead of the event, the Grand Prix Drivers Association, which was effectively a union for F1 drivers that largely advocated for safer circuits, was furious about the poor condition of the track. Track organizers refused to make the necessary repairs to the barriers lining the circuit, which resulted in crew members from various race teams going out with their tools and making the repairs themselves. Unfortunately, those barriers played a role in the weekend's horror. After countless delays and several crashes due to spilled oil, the rear wing of Rolf Stommelin's Embassy Hill machine broke. He crashed into the exact barrier his own team had worked on repairing before being launched across the track. He flew over the barrier on the opposite side of the racing surface, and his car struck and killed 4 people, 2 photographers, 1 fireman, and 1 spectator. The race continued for 4 laps before it was red flagged on lap 29 of 75. Because the race stopped before 60% of the distance had been completed, the FIA only offered half points. Lella Lombardi had been sitting in 6th position at the time of the red flag. Because of the format of the F1 point system at the time, she was awarded half of a single point. But that half point remains the only point ever scored by a woman in Formula One. Lombardi contested the rest of the 1975 season, but with little success. She entered 4 races in 76, 1 with March and 3 with Brabham. She failed to qualify for 2 of those events and finished outside the top 10 in the other 2. That being said, she proceeded to have a comfortable racing career outside of Formula One, including a 2nd place in class at the 24 Hours of Le Mans alongside Christine Decremont. Sadly, Lombardi passed away from breast cancer on the 3rd of March, 1992, when she was just 50 years old. She was succeeded by her partner, Fiorenza. She remains the only out-gay person to have ever competed in Formula One. Now, finally, that brings us to our final player of the 1977 Firecracker 400, Janet Guthrie. Guthrie was born in Iowa City, Iowa on March 7, 1938, though her family moved to Florida when she was young. And as she told me in our conversation together, I was born adventurous and grew up insufficiently socialized, which she claims is a large part of the reason why she developed such a love of speed. Guthrie's father was a pilot, and as you might imagine, she grew up as a passenger in small planes after her family moved just outside of Miami, and it didn't take long for her to crave the act of flying for herself. She began taking flight lessons and secured her pilot's license when she was just 17. I want to quote Guthrie at length from our interview here because she describes the transition from flight to motorsport best herself. It all started with the flying, really. When I got out of college and went to work at Republic Aviation out in Long Island, I was offered a half share in an AT-6, a World War II training plane that stressed for 6 Gs positive and 6 Gs negative. Back then, it was $650 for a half share. They go for hundreds of thousands these days. I went out and I looked at it, and I thought about air traffic control zones and all the heavy airline traffic in and around Long Island. There just really wasn't any place to go and do aerobatics and have fun with a plane like that. So I didn't get the AT-6. In 1960, I went away and bought a 1953 XK120 Jaguar Coupe instead, just because it was such a beautiful thing. Then I found out what I could do with it. See, Guthrie's initial pursuit was in aerospace engineering and physics. She was one of a handful of women taking on the challenging STEM programs at the University of Michigan, and she was even an early candidate for NASA's astronaut programs. But that Jaguar XK120 really changed things. As she started taking it out to gymkhanas, she learned the art of car control and became friends with other folks in New York's racing scene. Soon she was entering Sports Car Club of America races and funneling all of the money she was making at Republic Aviation into maintaining and improving her racing cars and furthering her motorsport endeavors. In the SCCA, Guthrie told me, gender wasn't an issue. She said, "Women have been active for a very long time in Sports Car Club of America, and it just really wasn't a very big deal. Acceptance was based on your capability, like with any racing driver. It was quite a shock when I got my chance at Indianapolis in a NASCAR Cup racing, how widespread were the opinions to the contrary. At that level, even though I had 13 years of experience in sports car racing, and I had twice won my class at the Sebring 12-hour, and I had driven the Daytona 24 in company with drivers like Mario Andretti, Lloyd Ruby, Dan Gurney, and a number of other famous names who had made their mark in Indy cars, that experience didn't seem to count for anything." That quote alone should tell you just how good Guthrie had become. In the SCCA and in sports car racing, she was a respected competitor who was competing with distinction at some of the biggest endurance events in America. She had well earned her place in motorsport, but all was not well as the 1970s progressed. Guthrie described her life situation to me as it stood at the end of 1975. "I had no house, no jewelry, no insurance, no husband. I had one used-up race car, and I was saying to myself, you really must come to your senses and make some provision for your old age." That's when she got the call from Rolla Volstedt. Volstedt was a hugely influential race car designer who had been one of the first men to implement rear-mounted engines and aerodynamic wings in American open-wheel racing. He'd been building and entering cars in races like the Indianapolis 500 for years when he decided to pick up the phone to see if Janet Guthrie might like to test an Indy car. Reflecting on his decision to hire Guthrie later, Volstedt said, "Racing needed a woman at Indy, and I needed a driver. That's one of the reasons I went after a woman who would call attention to the team." Guthrie was wary of the opportunity. Yes, she was comforted by Volstedt's long history at Indianapolis and by his position on the board of directors for the United States Auto Club, which sanctioned open-wheel racing in America. But she had been bitten before by seemingly good opportunities where she'd be invited to test a car only to arrive and find the machine to be ill-prepared and the mechanics to be uninterested in actually helping her get it up to racing spec. So she agreed to a test at Ontario Motor Speedway in an effort to get acquainted with the car and to also try her hand at open-wheel machines for the first time. I won't bog you down in too many details because Guthrie's life and her racing endeavors will make a great episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys in the future. Suffice it to say that the test went well, and Guthrie confidently agreed to take on the challenge of the Indianapolis 500. However, 1976 was a letdown. Guthrie passed rookie orientation, in which new drivers are required to make several laps of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway at increasingly higher speeds to prove that they can handle the challenge. She got in some practice laps. However, her car was plagued by a slew of mechanical and engine problems, and she didn't get a chance to qualify. She would have to come back again the next year. Thankfully for her, and for all of us, 1977 was more successful. She was once again plagued by difficulties, but Guthrie was able to take her car out on the final day of qualifying to make that all-important 4-lap run. Her average speed of 188.403 miles per hour wasn't just good enough to get her in the field. It was good enough to put her there comfortably, meaning she wouldn't have to worry about any of the other drivers setting faster times and bumping her out of the field. It was the first time a woman ever qualified for the Indianapolis 500. Race day, though, was frustrating. The team's fuel tank hose was leaking methanol before the race even started, and officials threatened to disqualify the team. They made repairs, but engine trouble brought Guthrie into the pits repeatedly for several long delays. She retired on lap 149, having only completed 27 laps herself. Her 9th place finish in the 500 the following year, with a fractured wrist to boot, was a much-needed salve to ease the pain of the previous 2 years. Her time at the Indy 500 really highlighted the fact that motorsport simply was not designed with female competitors in mind. Guthrie was regularly the only woman in the garage area at Indianapolis, and she faced ample pushback from track officials who still believed women shouldn't be there because for a long time, women had been banned from the pits and garage. There were new bathroom or shower facilities for women in the garage, so when she retired from the race doused in fuel in 1977, she needed an escort to make sure she could access a shower and use it privately. During that time, Guthrie had also begun racing in NASCAR, trying to get in as much track time as possible when she wasn't otherwise obligated to race in IndyCar. But in NASCAR, similarly harsh mindsets prevailed. When she debuted in the series, male fans chanted "No tits in the pits" at her anytime they saw her walk by. As had happened in IndyCar, many of her male competitors took to the media to complain that she shouldn't be allowed to race because women weren't strong enough or smart enough. They would be too busy fixing their makeup to make moves on the track, and they'd faint at the first signs of trouble. I asked Guthrie about that, how she could keep her game face on when she was facing so much backlash simply by existing. "Oh, I didn't care," she told me. "They were just another car to beat." Guthrie raced into 1980, but after that, her career began to fizzle out. Even though she was in her early 40s, she still felt completely confident in her ability to race, but it was getting increasingly more difficult to find both the funding she needed and a team that was willing to field her. The fact that no company stepped up to sponsor her forced Guthrie into an early retirement, even though she felt like she could continue to keep racing. In 1987, she told the Los Angeles Times, "Men are getting sponsorship and women can't. That sounds unfair, but who cares about unfair? What counts is the bottom line. Sponsors want the publicity that racing brings, but a successful woman driver will get 10 times the attention that a man will get. So now, what really is important? It keeps coming back to the good old boy network. A lot of corporations are spending a lot of tax-deductible dollars to sponsor male racing drivers." It took a while for mindsets to change enough to allow motorsport to recognize Guthrie. While she was inducted into the International Women's Sports Hall of Fame in 1980, it took motorsport until 2006 to recognize her same achievements. And it took NASCAR until this very year, 2024, to do the same. So now that you know all of these incredible women, let's get into the thick of our story this week. Let's talk about the 1977 Firecracker 400. We're chatting about NASCAR this week on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, and if you're looking to grab a few items of incredible Hendrick Motorsports merch, make sure to check out more from my sponsor, Homefield Apparel. Homefield does an incredible job researching and understanding the history of the teams and events they create clothing for, which means everything is of incredible quality. Check out the link in my bio for more, and don't forget to use code DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. Heading into the 1976 Firecracker 400, Janet Guthrie had the offer of a lifetime. She'd found some comfortable success in NASCAR after her debut that year, to the extent that her primary sponsor, Kelly Girl, a staffing company for temporary office workers, was prepared to keep paying for her to race. But she received a phone call that could have changed everything. She was offered a ride in a Richard Petty team car sponsored by STP. Such a car should be first-rate, but would it actually, Guthrie mused in her autobiography, A Life at Full Throttle. This golden apple could be poisoned with no trouble at all. See, Richard Petty was one of the most vocal drivers who had never hesitated to speak out against Guthrie in the press. He said of Guthrie, quote, "She's no lady. If she was, she'd be at home. There's a lot of differences in being a lady and being a woman." In my interview with Guthrie, She pointed out that many of her male competitors were willing to admit that they'd changed their minds about her when she proved their expectations wrong. But Richard Petty was one of the only drivers who remained firm in his assessment that she didn't belong, no matter how well she raced. In the end, Guthrie turned down that offer. Taking the one-off seat with the Petty team for the Firecracker 400 would mean turning down a 6-race deal that Cali Girl had offered her. 6 races with a reliable sponsor was better than 1 race with a team that could very well sabotage her before the race even began. When she arrived at the track for that race weekend, headlines blared, "Beware, gentlemen, Guthrie is in Daytona." I bring up the 1976 race because I really think it sets the tone for what happened the following year in 1977. By that point, Guthrie had been competing in as many NASCAR races as she could when her schedule allowed. She'd proved some naysayers wrong, and her presence at the track was greeted less harshly than it was before. But the 1977 Firecracker 400 brought a new surprise. When practice for the race began on Friday, July 1st, Guthrie found that she wasn't the only woman at the track. Instead, she was joined in the field by Lella Lombardi and Christine Becker, 2 of the most prominent female racers in all of Europe, and NASCAR was paying their expenses. The Miami Herald speculated that Bill France, CEO of NASCAR, had spent up to $25,000 in expenses and guarantees to bring them out. But as Guthrie told me in our interview, she was never clear if that meant $25,000 per woman or $25,000 total. In her autobiography, she writes that sum seemed extremely conservative. Lombardi and Becker were set up with great equipment fielded by some of the best teams. In her autobiography, Guthrie writes that Chevrolet had been asked to give Lombardi a great engine and to have it tuned by a highly regarded and hugely expensive race shop to the sum of about $10,000. Christine Becker was with the less impressive Donlevy Racing team, but both she and Lombardi had been assigned garage spaces next to some of the top-tier drivers in the field. The assumption was that by embedding these women in and amongst the stars of the sport, they might be able to get up to speed much quicker. Guthrie, meanwhile, was racing for an operation that was infinitely smaller in a Chevy entered by Linda Ferrari. The outfit was billed as a back marker, and as I'll cover here in a moment, they were often totally segregated from the rest of the NASCAR field in the garage area, preventing them from learning from others through proximity. While 3 women had previously competed in the same NASCAR race back in 1949, the 1977 Firecracker 400 came at a time when a push for more equality for women was met by strong backlash, and the newspapers took the bait laid out by official press releases from NASCAR and Daytona that described the event as a showdown between the 3 women. Papers started calling it a catfight, and reporters tailed all 3 women, hoping to catch them claw each other's eyes out. But Guthrie refused to give them that satisfaction. In her autobiography, she writes that she was asked how it felt to compete against the 2 best women drivers in the world. She responded, "I'm delighted. It indicates NASCAR is coming to understand what I've always said is true. On the track, being a woman doesn't make a bit of difference. And we won't be running against each other, but against the 60-plus other drivers who are entered for this event." However, Guthrie and her manager Linda Ferrari actually had a much different perspective. I'm going to quote here more extensively from Guthrie's autobiography because I think it really illustrates the thought process of the time, and it also establishes some of the context as to why Guthrie and Linda Ferrari felt the way they did. NASCAR's attempts to hamstring our operation had been relatively subtle so far. The worst they had done, at least as far as we knew, was delay our tech inspections at most events as long as possible, cutting our practice short. As an annoyance, they usually left us out in the rain without a garage until we had qualified for a race and the non-qualifiers who'd had a roof over their heads had gone home, and we had never failed to qualify. So why was Bill France, the man who'd yelled at Humpy Wheeler for inviting me to Charlotte for my first NASCAR race, suddenly in love with these women drivers, smitten enough to spend this much money on them? Linda said, laughing, "That's easy. If they can discredit us in the eyes of our sponsor, they'll have taken a big step toward purging their fields of women altogether." With two top-tier European road racers who were unlikely to ever return to Winston Cup racing, it wasn't their game after all, driving the best equipment that NASCAR's wealth and power could command, and their showdown press releases, NASCAR was stepping up the heat. "Why?" I asked. "Haven't you read all those letters to National Speed Sport News," Linda said, "about how if a woman can qualify at Indianapolis like you just did, that proves championship racing is a panty-waist sport and real race fans should go back to sprint car races where the real men are?" Indeed, I had read those letters. "So," Linda went on, "NASCAR isn't stupid. They don't want the status of their sport to be downgraded, as professions often are when women enter them." When we reflect on that today, that's a horrible thought, but it likely held a lot of truth. Yes, Guthrie had more NASCAR experience than the women she would be competing against, but the hope was that those other women would prove to be just talented enough and to have just good enough equipment that they could make Guthrie look like a fool. If an inexperienced Lombardi or Becker made a great impression compared to someone who had been competing in these stock car racing events for over a year, it could somehow prove that Guthrie wasn't actually talented. The European women could go back home to their more familiar series with pride, and Guthrie would be laughed out of NASCAR. Still, Guthrie sought out both women to offer any help they might need, as reporters flocked to the area, practically foaming at the mouths in hopes of watching the three women fight. Instead, their meeting was tame, as Guthrie offered some tips on driving a heavy stock car, and also offered to teach them how to draft if they needed. It was a kind olive branch to extend to two women who both struggled with English, and who both were still likely excluded from any actual legitimate talks with men in NASCAR. In fact, both of the European women shared some extremely telling quotes. Lombardi has long been reported as saying that driving a stock car was, quote, like riding a buffalo. Meanwhile, Becker admitted that when I first took it out on track, I thought, what am I doing here? When I asked Guthrie about her impressions of her two female competitors, she told me they were two of the best women drivers in the world. They had amassed quite a record, Lella Lombardi and Christine Becker. I didn't feel particularly threatened, which was clearly NASCAR's intent. They set these three women up with some very good cars, but I thought that no matter how good a driver was, driving their first NASCAR race, they weren't likely to do better than someone who had, by that time, half a year's experience and had driven at Daytona before. So we met, and of course all these reporters were standing around watching to see us scratch each other's eyes out. I thought that was pretty funny. No, I said that if at any point they wanted to draft with me, I would be happy to work with them, and any questions they had that I could answer, I'd be glad to. It all played out rather as I expected. Some reporters actually did take the time to speak with the women competing in the series. Quote, "Richard Petty and Buddy Baker told me I was too low in the corners on Saturday," Becker said, though, of course, the journalist writing the story simply had to describe her as petite. "I was feeling my way along. Now I understand it's all right to go up the banking. Now I'm beginning to feel comfortable in the car." She also added, "Janet Guthrie said she was willing to show us about drafting. I thought that was quite nice. She seems quite happy we are here." Lombardi said, via an interpreter, "At first the car seemed too fast, then it was just right. Now it's not fast enough for me." However, if you look at most of the other media coming out of the weekend, it was pretty grim. In one story from the Tampa Bay Times, veteran racer Dick Brooks was quoted as sharing his ulterior motive for offering his help to the women. Quote, "They're good race drivers, but not only that, they're good looking too." In a different Tampa Bay Times story, Brooks railed against women getting opportunities he believed they didn't deserve. "They never had to race on the sportsman circuit, and they never had to put together an old car in the backyard," he said, completely ignorant to the histories of all three of these women. "They get paid high dollars because they're women, and they take away a spot from a guy who is trying to make a living on the circuit. If they're here just for women's equality, I don't think they belong here. Speaking on Guthrie's entrance to NASCAR, Brooks added, Janet got what she wanted because she's a woman. There were a lot of men who didn't qualify for the Indy 500 last year either, but you didn't see anybody else waving money in their faces to come to the World 600. They're welcome here, and it's good, I guess, because it creates a new interest and gets a different crowd involved. But I don't think they should be here just because they're women. Multiple reports referred to Lombardi, Becker, and Guthrie as, quote, the girls who have invaded auto racing or the Firecracker fillies, while one news report was titled Daytona's European Ladies, They're Something Else. That same story featured the quote, to American men, an American woman in a race car is just a woman driver. But European women are European women first, and drivers second, as far as the garage area crowd seems to be concerned. Thus, Lombardi and Becker are treated more like European film stars, while Guthrie is simply a driver. In the Tennessean, writer Larry Woody went on a whole rant about the presence of women in NASCAR, kicking off with, don't look now, fellows, but there's a lady in the pits. Oops, better make that 2 ladies. And look, over there, another one. And they're all wearing racing uniforms. Holy lug wrench, what's stock car racing coming to? Next thing you know, they'll be serving tea at pit stops and planting pansies in the infield and hanging curtains along pit road. Chanel No. 5 will compete for space in the garage area with exhaust fumes and cigar smoke. Later in the same story, he writes, there are 2 primary concerns among the men drivers who, until last year, had never to worry about tipping their hats in the pit area. 1, that they'll be beaten by one of the women, and 2, that they'll be run over by one of the women. Actually, one is about as remote as the other. That's about the closest thing to a compliment Larry Woody was going to give to them. Guthrie was quoted in that same article as saying, we aren't out there to do anything except drive our cars. We aren't women's libbers. We aren't out here to prove anything in a battle of the sexes. We are just out there to race. In another story, Guthrie is quoted as saying, we're probably not quite ready to challenge Petty, Pearson, Yarborough, and those other champions, but we'll be in the ballpark. Interestingly, one article quoted Vic Alford at length, citing him as being Becker's boyfriend. He said, I can't see Lella being impressed by the other drivers in the race, but Christine may be intimidated by the grandeur of the occasion. Lella is very aggressive. She will not be impressed by a Richard Petty or a Cale Yarborough breathing down her neck. Christine might be. Physically, the girls tell me the stock car is lighter to drive than a prototype. For instance, prototypes are much harder to hold on the 31-degree banking. The problem is the sheer size of the stock car. While they're used to placing the slimmer prototypes within an inch of the wall, the women at first were getting the stock cars only within a foot or 2 of the wall. It's a matter of experience, and after a week of driving, they're getting much closer. Alford was allegedly set to communicate with both women during the race, as they all spoke French. Becker said she knew, quote, English for all the words of a race car, but Lombardi had pretty much no grasp of the language. On her dashboard, they'd pasted a list of numbers, lined up with Italian words for things like oil and tires. So if her radio malfunctioned, she could express her needs by raising a certain number of fingers. I think my favorite comment to the media that weekend, though, was made by Guthrie. Junior Johnson had said something about how he felt Guthrie had grown more serious about her racing career this year, and she took a serious problem with that statement. He's wrong, she said. They didn't take me seriously. Only one person bothered to ask Guthrie about her thoughts on how NASCAR had shunned her presence just a year previously, only to go out of their way to spend thousands to bring in foreign women. She had a very diplomatic take, saying, it took a lot of guts for Kelly Girl to put money on the line for a full year to put me in racing, particularly when the whole world was shouting publicity stunt a year ago. This is a serious racing operation and always has been. The whole weekend must have been a trial. The swampy Florida heat was as intense as the press coverage. Guthrie struggled to find speed amid the blistering temperatures, but at the last minute, she and her mechanics made the right tweaks that earned them a spot in the field. However, her team owner had joked to the press that instead of changing the car, quote, "We changed the driver's mind. We told her that if she didn't run faster, we were going to throw her in a lake." A joke, yes, but one that fell flat on Guthrie. Still, Guthrie managed to set a faster time than both of the European drivers, as crewman Jack Bryant, who had turned up to a race earlier that year with a black eye secured in a fight that resulted from his desire to defend his team's decision to hire a woman driver, he laughed and said, "They're spending $50,000 to blow us into the weeds and they can't do it." All three women did make the field, but the race itself was miserable. On lap 11, Janet Guthrie's engine blew. "It's impossible to describe the frustration of such a moment," Guthrie writes in her autobiography. "You have entered the space necessary to launch a 3,700-pound race car through 400 miles of competition with some 40 others, dancing through the turns at speeds greater than a Boeing 737's on takeoff. Then you are cut off, ousted, and there is nothing you can do with all of the force you've marshaled. I hadn't even worked up a sweat yet." At the very least, it was the push that Guthrie and Ferrari needed to make a significant change, swapping from a Ralph Moody car to one fielded by Jim Lindholm. The event was no better, unfortunately, for the European women. On lap 33, Beckers suffered a brake failure that put her out of the race. Just before the halfway point of the event, a massive storm put the racing action on hold for 2 hours. Rain poured on the first and second turns, while the third and fourth turns remained baked in the hot Florida sunshine. The race restarted when the track had dried, and after waiting all that time, on lap 103, the rear end of Lombardi's car failed. She, too, was out. Richard Petty ultimately took victory in the race, and after the event, he said that all three women performed well, as far as he could see. "Actually, I never did see but one, and she blowed up," Petty said, referring to Guthrie. "Oh, well, I did see Lombardi a couple times, but she was way down out of the way. The girls done real good today." Obviously, the race didn't end the way that any of the women would have wanted, but it also didn't end with a win for NASCAR, at least in the sense that no one woman outshined the other. As expected, Lombardi and Christine Becker both returned to Europe to continue their racing careers, never to compete in Winston Cup racing again, while Janet Guthrie went on to compete in both NASCAR and IndyCar. Later that year in Bristol, Janet Guthrie recorded her best ever finish during the Volunteer 400 when she crossed the line in 6th. It was the result, she told me, that did the most to change the perceptions of her in the paddock. "I recognized a big change in the garage area at Talladega in August of 1977, she told me, and it might have had something to do with my 6th-place finish at Bristol earlier that month. That was the turning point, but it was a slow process." As we said, Guthrie's career did begin to wind down the year after. She secured her best finish of 9th in the 1978 Indy 500, and in 1979 she started 14th but failed to finish. The following year, 1980, she couldn't qualify. She was unable to secure the funding she needed to continue. Three women have not competed in the same NASCAR race since that day, despite many fears at the time that women would somehow overtake the sport. The next woman to enter a NASCAR Cup Series race was Robin McCall in 1982, followed by Patty Moise in 1987. The Firecracker 400 may not have been one of history's most memorable or remarkable races, but in many ways, I think that has done more harm to the overall view of women in American motorsport. Reflecting on the event today, it should serve as a reminder to ask ourselves what exactly should constitute a good faith effort at getting women involved in motorsport. This question has never exactly lost its relevance, but it's worth revisiting in 2024 the same way it is always worth revisiting. In some ways, it does seem as if the tides are turning, and that women are finding legitimate and welcome places in the racing world. There are incredible examples almost everywhere you look, and I think my favorite is Katherine Legg's latest Indy 500 effort. While plenty of people did focus on the fact that Legg is a woman in racing, she was able to take control of that narrative this year. Part of that came down to her sponsor, Elf Cosmetics, which went all out in its promotion of both Legg and the Indy 500. I wrote a lot about Legg and her Elf sponsorship this year because in many ways it felt revolutionary. It was one of the most authentic representations of the woman in racing theme that didn't feel forced or uncomfortable. It felt like a legitimate sign that the racing world is evolving and that it has begun to welcome women with open arms and to ask them to come into the race specifically to see women. At the same time, though, there are still some really valid concerns being raised about the nature of all-female racing series like F1 Academy. Is it a good idea to sequester female talent into its own series where young women will be prevented from competing with men? Are we doing enough to integrate those women into mixed gender grids after they've shown their skills in F1 Academy? And why are we overlying biological determinism on a sport that has no reason to separate competitors by their chromosomes or personal expression? Motorsport is at a really critical choice point when it comes to how we want to approach gender expression in the racing world. We're really finally understanding just what a key role women have historically played and the roles they currently play, but that kind of recognition often comes with backlash. Sometimes that backlash is so quiet and so insidious that we don't even notice it. That's why I like to point at the Firecracker 400. While there was plenty of media attention surrounding the 3 women in the race, none of that coverage truly interrogated NASCAR's goals. No one was bothering to ask why NASCAR saw fit to pay 2 foreign female drivers heaps of money to attempt to outshine the only woman regularly competing against its male drivers. And if they did ask why, they were regularly content with the surface level answer that it was good for marketing. We really only have 2 people on the record who questioned what NASCAR was doing: Janet Guthrie and Linda Ferrari. But because they were so intimately involved in the event, and because they were women, no one was listening. But it's just as hard to interrogate the powers that be on their equity goals today as it was back in the 70s. I don't mean that to sound like we should constantly nitpick and poke holes in things like F1 Academy, but to really ask how we can put structures in place that benefit women. A lot of race series, teams, and drivers could benefit from more people asking what their ultimate goals are. I hope this episode inspires you to ask those hard questions the next time you feel like a motorsport initiative may not be all it appears on the surface. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. Next time around, we're going to talk about Jim Hall, the American motorsport icon whose groundbreaking inventions were litigated out of existence by the FIA. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. And if you're hungry for more, please make sure to subscribe to the DPTJ Patreon. Tiered patrons will get exclusive access to weekly blog posts where I delve deeper into contemporary motorsport news, as well as newsletters rounding up big events, both past and present. Plus, if you want to send an email, I have an address for that, deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. I want to give a special shout out to my 2 world champions, Ryan Lorman and Nicole Washington. These folks subscribed to the World Champions Patreon tier, which means the absolute world to me. I want to thank you both for your support, to welcome you to the DPTJ family, and to let you know just how much it means that you appreciate the work I'm doing. I also want to read out a great comment I received from my good friend Jonty, who wrote on YouTube regarding the episode about the 1955 Le Mans disaster. The sheer horror of this event is hard to fully comprehend, but it's also very important that the story is told. Again, you tell it brilliantly with tact and professionalism. That is always my goal, and I am very pleased to hear that I accomplished it. Finally, don't forget to check out Home Field Apparel, the clothing company that's doing a lot for motorsport this year. Make sure to check out the link in my bio and use code DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each show. You can also find the full list of sources in the episode description. This week, my primary sources were Janet Guthrie's autobiography, A Life at Full Throttle, as well as an interview I conducted with her this April. I honestly cannot recommend her autobiography enough. It is brilliantly written. Guthrie is an incredible storyteller in the kind of way that makes you want to keep reading even though you know you should probably go and do something else. It's so good. It's the book that really changed my perspective on how people could write about racing and make it an art. Make sure you go get a copy, and if you can find it on Guthrie's website, get it from there, not on Amazon. I also reference plenty of old newspaper articles and a few online stories, all of which are listed in the description below. That's all from me this week. I will see you soon on the next episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys.